You've made it to our final lecture of geography, seniors. This is the last time that you will be listening to my beautiful, beautiful voice. No, just kidding. But this is it. You guys have made it to the end of the year, and fittingly, I think, personally, we are going to end our discussion of the geographic features of Earth with the literal end of the world in Antarctica. Antarctica, obviously, is a place that very few humans have been to, and it was the last continent not only to be truly discovered, but to be explored. And I mean truly discovered in the sense that people actually touched the land of Antarctica. Certainly there was knowledge about its existence earlier than there was even of Australia, but reaching it is difficult enough, and actually getting onto it proved to be a very troublesome proposition as well. And Antarctica, by the way, especially in modern times, with the focus on climate change and various environmental effects, has oftentimes entered into people's thoughts, and people are talking about Antarctica probably in ways that it's never been spoken of in the past. It's probably in more people's imagination today than it ever has been. And part of that's due to television, part of that's due to several award-winning penguin documentaries. And I know that sounds like that's really not worth noting, but penguin documentaries actually were big business. Maybe you remember March of the Penguins. That movie made a ton of money and really rocketed Antarctica and the study of Antarctica into many people's minds. And really quite interesting that a movie like that could do that. Today we want to not only cover the history of the exploration of Antarctica, but we want to talk about some of its geographical features, some of the wildlife that lives there, and finally we want to talk about the current state of Antarctica, which is, if you select Antarctica, what you will be researching in your worksheet this week. So let's go ahead and start with the history. Antarctica is the only continent on Earth that was completely uninhabited by humans. Obviously, the environment in Antarctica is very, very difficult to live in, even when you can bring in your own food and all of your own supplies. The temperatures in Antarctica are particularly cold, although the further northern sections of Antarctica during the summer do get above freezing. It's a common misconception that all of Antarctica is below freezing all of the time. And some of the islands and even the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, which if you look at the map, I know seeing Antarctica for what it really looks like is difficult even on a world map, but you'll note that a point sticks up towards South America. That's the Antarctic Peninsula. There are even some lichens and mosses that grow on some of those areas that can survive incredibly cold temperatures during the winter and take in just enough sunlight to survive. But there's certainly no agriculture in Antarctica. The only thing that you could reasonably expect to get in Antarctica on a regular basis would have been fish, and certainly the temperatures are simply too extreme for any humans to consider it worthwhile to live there before modern times. And even today, while there are some permanent or semi-permanent inhabitants of Antarctica, it's really too difficult and too expensive to live there. Would it be possible? Yes, humans do have the technology to live long-term in Antarctica if necessary, although not to grow our own food there, which would obviously be a problem. But it really isn't done. It simply proves too expensive, too difficult to do. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that later on in the lecture. The first Europeans to discover the pieces of ice connected to Antarctica were probably European whalers operating in the 15 and 1600s. It was widely known that it was very difficult to sail too far south. Of course, Europeans understood that the world was a circle or a sphere, and it was very difficult to sail too far south because there's actually a bank of wind and current that continuously flows around Antarctica, and this is called the Antarctic winds or the Antarctic cycle. And you can actually use this to your advantage to sail different places if you would like to. In fact, if you want to think of it this way, the wind and currents generally flow from the west to the east. By the way, the same flow of wind and water is what allowed Vasco da Gama to eventually get around the southern point of Africa, because it extends even that far up. Now, With that being said, it's very likely that some Europeans did punch through this dense wall of wind and current and actually sail straight down. Difficult, but certainly not impossible. And the main reason they would have done so is their quest for large mammals, specifically whales and seals. European whalers and sealers, not stealers, sealers, probably pursued their quarries down into these very cold latitudes, pretty early on into their exploration of the world oceans. And we do have a little bit of slightly controversial, and I mean, like, I say slightly controversial because who really cares when whalers discovered things? It's kind of a niche field, to say the least. There is some debate about when they might have landed on certain islands. There's some islands that are within sight range of where the ice sheet was at various times throughout history, where we found remnants of whaling camps going back all the way to the late 1500s, early 1600s. So it's possible that some Norwegians or English or American sailors sailed as far south as Antarctica in the 1600s. However, we are fairly confident that they did not actually make it to any type of landmass or ice mass that could be called Antarctica. And the reason for this is something that's oftentimes called the Antarctic ice wall. The ice wall, or the ice shelf itself, is actually a pretty formidable thing to get on top of. The ice wall is effectively a huge, unbroken cliff, and there's really no easy way to access it. And because the wind and the waves can push you, and because ice tends to jut out sometimes underneath the water, the Titanic giving an example of how this can occur on an iceberg, it was very dangerous to approach the wall. And several whalers were rumored to have gone down in the frigid waters, and of course there's no surviving hitting water that cold. You die after a few minutes. And so people tended to stay away from the ice itself. And so we don't have any guaranteed landings in Antarctica until actually the 1800s. Certainly the ice shelf was written about and cited, although this was a feat in and of itself. In fact, Captain James Cook is the first European captain known to have seen the ice wall, although again, most historians don't believe he was actually the first one, but the first one to give us detailed findings of what he saw there. But it's not until the 1800s that Europeans had the technology level required to approach the ice shelf and get on top of it. And those people are oftentimes considered to be the first people to arrive in Antarctica. Now, it should be noted that the Antarctic Peninsula is actually where most of the first expeditions to Antarctica touch down, because that area is much easier to get onto. In fact, some of the areas of the Antarctic Peninsula are actually rock and stone, exposed ground, and so it's much easier to get ashore there. Although people didn't really explore that section of Antarctica. It was so barren and devoid of anything of interest that for some reason it was not focused on by Europeans. Most Europeans sailed towards the ice shelves, which surround much of the rest of Antarctica, and that's where the first exploration really began. Now, Antarctica itself does host a number of very unique animals, and by the way, if you ever get the chance, National Geographic has some great documentaries, not only on the animals that live on top of the ice that you're familiar with, things like the leopard seal and penguins of course are always cute, but there's actually an incredible amount of living things that live underneath the ice, down in the water, underneath the ice shelf, that are incredibly unique looking. And if you get a chance, I highly encourage you to go look up the National Geographic documentaries on this stuff. Very, very fascinating. It looks like an alien planet. I mean, no, number one, it's underwater. That always looks interesting. But number two, these plants are like nothing you've never seen. Let's just say they don't look like normal coral reefs, and we'll leave it at that. European explorers were primarily interested in the South Pole for two things. Number one, they wanted to know where the magnetic South Pole was. That was a focus and a destination for Europeans. Another reason is that Europeans were still in the claim things and take them for their mother country phase. And so both the British and the French claimed parts of Antarctica with kind of the intention, I think, eventually of taking the whole thing, assuming that there would be something of value on the continent, because there certainly had been something of value on all other continents. And there is potentially the possibility that Antarctica hides mineral resources. Some people even believe that there are significant amounts of oil in Antarctica, although I don't think that has been decisively proven, although several people have run pretty sophisticated tests to show that it is certainly possible. But the reality is that getting to any of those resources was well beyond the technological level of the 1800s for European nations. Because as it turns out, that while Antarctica itself is a physical location, there is real rock and stone underlying much of what we think of as Antarctica. It's almost completely covered by an ice sheet that is, in most places, approximately 1 mile thick. And mining through 1 mile of ice would be ridiculous, to say the least, and if not completely impossible. Certainly, again, for the technology level of the 1800s, almost impossible. Today's technology, probably possible, although I haven't seriously heard anyone thinking that we should mine all the way down there, although that might come up in your lifetimes, and I'll explain more about that as we get a little deeper into the lecture. European explorers continued to land once they became more technologically capable and began learning how to construct ships that could survive contact with the ice or even getting locked in the ice. There's several famous photos of British expeditions where the ship is up on the ice shelf. That is not because they purposely put it there. They actually got caught in the ice. The ice literally picks the ship up out of the ocean as it freezes seawater, and or rather, it combines sea ice, which is seawater turned into ice, with freshwater drop ice, which is snow that fell out of the sky and got compressed. And eventually the process actually lifts the ship out of the ice, or it crushes the ship to many splinters, which is what would happen to earlier ships. But well-constructed ships could survive this process and get up on top of the ice. So there's some really cool photos out there that you can track down on the internet of these ships sitting on top of the ice. And again, not intentional, but the ships could survive this. So the British continued to explore, but Antarctica was also a destination for other cold weather explorers, probably the most famous of which were the Norwegians. The Norwegians were busy exploring the North Pole, and they wanted to explore the South Pole as well. And we have a very famous race that occurred in the early 1900s between the Scott expedition and the Rolf Amundsen expedition. And these are two separate expeditions to attempt to reach the magnetic South Pole. The Scott expedition was sponsored by the British government. The Amundsen expedition was sponsored by the Norwegian government. And there's both triumph and tragedy in the story. Amundsen successfully made it to the pole and back to his ship using a very, very good route. In fact, it's traditionally the route used to get to the pole. If you want to go to see the pole today, which is possible, you can actually buy a tour to go do that. Well, probably not right now, Corona and all that. But you can. During summer months in Antarctica, you can go down to the pole if you want to. And Scott, unfortunately, chose a different route, and he was nowhere near as well prepared. The Norwegians went in. Number one, the Norwegians were all very veteran Arctic explorers. They brought very well-trained sled dogs, and they moved very quickly and were in and out quite well. Unfortunately, the Scott expedition did not fare very well at all. The dogs kept dying from the cold. They were inexperienced. And while many people believe that Scott made it to the pole, unfortunately, it seems likely that he died on the way back. And eventually his camp was discovered with his journals. And again, the journals indicate that he made it to the pole, but that he died at some point on the way back. Again, exactly when that occurs is not exactly clear because he had an entire team with him, and we're not sure who died last and who wrote the final entries and all that kind of fun stuff. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look it up. The Scott expedition is quite interesting, if it is tragic, certainly. There's also the interesting piece of trivia information that the last person to die in the Scott expedition was quite possibly the most isolated human being of all time, because the Amundsen expedition had already left, and there was no one else on Antarctica at all, and so they would have been more than 3,000 miles isolated from any other human being, which is even farther than the Apollo astronauts, if you can believe that. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that humans that have literally orbited the moon were not quite as far away as that poor last guy in the Scott expedition. Anyway, we won't focus on the macabre. After this point, exploration of Antarctica is much more scientific in nature. Now, as the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s roll on, the leaders of the world change. No longer is Britain in charge, but instead the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States and Soviet Union look down at Antarctica and the competing claims of the many separate governments and their scientific bases and decide instead that they actually have rights to claims based on their power and the possible risk of letting the other superpower establish bases in Antarctica. And people decided, and I think this is pretty historic in this sense, that maybe militarizing Antarctica does not sound like the best plan on Earth. And so in 1960, Antarctica was actually the focus of the very first peace agreement made between the Soviet Union and the United States. And basically that peace agreement said that Antarctica will be free, first off, of international borders. Number 2, of weapon systems of any kind. And number 3, it will be free from resource exploitation, specifically mining. And this is often called the Antarctic Mining Ban and the Antarctic Peace Treaty. So the weapons and the lack of boundaries are both effective indefinitely, but not permanently. So what that means is that currently all nations act as if Antarctica has no land claims and no borders, despite the fact that 11 countries claim specific pieces of territory, and 2 countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, claim the right to later divide themselves territory. And of course the Soviet Union collapsed, so now it's Russia. And so most countries build their bases in the areas in which they make their claims. The United States builds generally in British areas because the British areas are friendly towards the United States. And the Soviet Union builds, or the Russians build, in some other areas that, again, you can look up a map and see these spots. Explaining it to you via this form, probably not as effective as simply looking the map up yourself. But you can look up the map. It's pretty easy to find if you're curious exactly which sections of Antarctica each side claims. Now, what do they do with their bases that they do establish? Well, these are primarily scientific bases, and a number of things are being studied. Number 1, the size, scope, and density of the ice, and that can tell us a lot of things about the history of the planet. Although, again, I should point out that many people take ice core samples as definitive proof of hundreds of thousands of years of history, and it should be pointed out that evidence from Greenland suggests that each ice layer indicates a snowstorm. And so many people count layers and say, the Earth is 100, this ice is 100,000 years old because I found 100,000 layers. But what that really indicates is 100,000 snowfalls. And people assume that today there's only one snowfall per year, so for the past 100,000 years that must have been the case. But of course, this is assuming a uniform rate of snow deposit, and of course there could be other explanations. And especially if we have, a massive water event like, say, a global flood, we could experience huge numbers of ice and snowfalls in the years after that, explaining a number of the lower layers. So anyway, that's just something for your general knowledge as a Christian, hopefully as a biblical literalist, at least when it comes to the creation account. You keep that in mind as you study Antarctica, because I think there's some really interesting things coming out of Antarctica, some great things that we can learn, but it's important to keep that in mind. A scientific fact that I am always amazed by, however, is a Russian finding back in 2008. They dug a core all the way a mile down into a sub-ice lake, and that's because of the interesting quality of water. If you pressurize it, it turns back into water at a certain point, and so there are actually liquid water lakes underneath many of the toughest ice sheets in Antarctica. And when the Russians got this core sample out, the drill bit itself came up with microbes on it, which indicates that there are in fact bacteria that live in lakes under the ice more than 1 mile underneath the ground. And this is an example of some of the hardiest life forms that we have ever discovered. And I just find that fascinating that a species could possibly survive down there. I say could possibly because there is some question about whether these things were actually contaminated on the drill, like they were microbes that got on the drill before it got into the ice and they just found them again. So there is some question about whether this is true or not, but I tend to believe that these were actually extracted out of the ice itself. These scientific research stations also are there for monitoring of something that you actually might have heard of. And again, this is primarily because of its connection to ecological science and climate change and global warming, and that is the ozone hole. Unfortunately, the ozone hole is a major ecological problem created by humans in the 1950s and the 1960s. A chemical compound used in refrigerants, both air conditioners and your common refrigerator, was used commonly throughout the entirety of the Western world. And the problem is that in the manufacturing process and in the scrapping of these units, this chemical compound would get out into the atmosphere. And when it would do that, it would reach the upper atmosphere, and unfortunately, it was a catalyst for ozone breakdown. Effectively, to simplify the scientific process for you, and again, you can look this up, it's quite fascinating, what this chemical compound would do is it would bind with an ozone particle, and the resultant chemical compound could be split apart by sunlight. And that sunlight, that solar radiation, would effectively split the ozone atom into 2 pieces of oxygen, which is O2, normal oxygen, and then a single oxygen molecule, which would oftentimes go and connect itself to two hydrogen atoms and become water. And unfortunately, the chemical compound being released in the atmosphere was not destroyed in this chemical process. And so effectively what it would do is it would keep finding particles of ozone, combining with them, resulting in that ozone particle breaking down. And it would do this continuously for years at a time, until the compound itself finally broke up into its constituent parts. And the problem is that while these chemicals were coming up all over the world into the atmosphere, they did not seem to affect the areas directly over them. And the reason for this, we found out later, is because of how ozone and wind patterns distribute ozone throughout the planet. Basically, these compounds were primarily moved to the two polar regions, and most definitely focused on the South Pole rather than the North Pole. The North Pole does have this issue, but nowhere near as badly as the South Pole does. Effectively, what happened is the strength of the ozone in the South Pole region was reduced from 500 plus parts per million down to less than 100 parts per million in the 1970s. And effectively what this did is it opened up the southern hemisphere at times to significantly more solar radiation than would be there otherwise. And this radiation not only increased global temperatures, but could cause increased cancer rates as well. Now, the United States and the other Western nations began to realize the scope of the problem and that they needed to stop using this compound. In the late 1970s, they did ban the compound, but the problem is that the compound does not break down quickly. In fact, there is still some of this compound up there catalyzing with ozone and causing problems. Although the ozone hole has seemed to be repairing itself over the past few decades. It's gotten smaller, and the general ozone content in the hole itself has increased. But I think the ozone layer stands as an example of why, as humans, we do bear a responsibility to be careful ecologically. I personally do not find the narrative of human-caused climate change to be very convincing. I think the Earth is an incredibly complicated system that goes through climate cycles, and back in the 1940s and 1950s we were having an incredibly cold cycle, and today we are in a warm cycle. And I think the Earth self-regulates itself to a certain extent, but there are definitely things that human beings can do that can mess with the balance of Earth. And while I think the Earth itself will recover and be just fine, it can cause significant amounts of human hardship if we're not very careful. Again, I mentioned the cancer incidents that ozone caused. I don't think the temperature problems are anything that the Earth could not deal with over time. But think about all the families affected by cancer. Think about your own loved ones that might have been affected by cancer in the past. Can you imagine an Earth devoid of ozone? Even if the temperatures go up a few degrees, that might not be so catastrophic as the Earth moderates its own temperature, but can you imagine dozens more people that you know personally dying of cancer? That is a very serious risk, and I think it's why we need to be responsible in our actions toward the environment. Not reactionary, not throwing out all that is old and replacing it with things that are new per se. However, it is being careful to make sure that what we are doing does not do damage that we are unprepared for and damage that we did not intend. And that's certainly what this chemical compound in these refrigerants were doing. That's a rather lengthy tangent to focus back on what you, if you are choosing to research Antarctica, will be looking at. That is modern settlement in Antarctica. Of course, there are many scientific stations, which are quite interesting, but two nations, Chile and Argentina, have actually been attempting to stake a more permanent claim on Antarctica, and to do this, they have actually set up permanent settlements. And these permanent settlements are very, very interesting. The one that if you choose to research Antarctica for your worksheet, I want you to look up is Base Esperanza, and it's an Argentinian facility. And I really like looking at this place and researching this place. It's effectively a collection of about 20 buildings with a population of about 120 people as of the time that I was doing this research, with information that was from last year. Again, I don't know if Corona has changed this or possibly changes in the Argentine government might have changed this in the year since I was doing this research, or it from the research year which I was able to get information from, which was 2019 as of the time of recording this. But it's really an interesting place. And in fact, the Argentine government a few years ago, and I couldn't find the job listing right now, so maybe somebody took it. But a few years ago, when I was teaching this class, the Argentine government was actually offering a job. They would pay for you to live and pay you a pretty sizable salary to go live at this colony and teach English and Spanish there. they were offering it to anybody who was qualified for it. So I jokingly mentioned to some of my students that here you go, if you want to go live in Antarctica, you should go and do this. And I think that would have been quite interesting had one of them chosen to do it. But it's quite interesting. The purpose of the colony is not because Antarctica is a great place to live, although I personally like cold, so I don't think I would mind it so much. On the other hand, my wife would certainly hate the entire process. But the real purpose is to attempt to make a claim on Antarctica, just in case that treaty ever runs out. And there are certain sections of the treaty that are going to run out. In fact, in the 2040s, the mining ban part of the treaty might come up for review. And so that might affect the future of Antarctica. And Chile and Argentina certainly want to make their claim. And their claim is primarily going to be, we have people who actually live there, therefore we should control the area. That's all I have for you guys. Hopefully this has been an interesting year in geography. Hopefully you've learned a lot more about the planet you live in. And hopefully something has piqued your interest. You know, the world is a big place, and the United States is a great country with many beautiful sights. But the world itself was created by God, and you should go out and you should explore it. Have some fun. Go and do things and see things that you never thought you'd see. And hopefully this year you've at least found one area, one thing that you'd want to go explore.